And without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to our lovely panel today.
Thank you so much, Annie. Welcome, everybody. This is the Collaborating for Publication, Conducting Cross-Disciplinary Scholarship on Writing. This session is sponsored by AWAC's Research and Publications Committee, of which Chris Basgier is here and myself are co-chairs. This session was originally scheduled to be a half-day workshop with roundtable discussions, but changes due to COVID obviously created some challenges. So what we're going to do is continue with our original plan, but in a modified form. So our goal for this panel is to share some of the benefits and challenges of collaborative interdisciplinary research and writing. We're going to start with asking our authors to share some stories, then move on to our editors, and then open to questions from the audience. And we expect that the majority of our time is going to be spent in maybe larger conversation with you all. If you have questions at any point, please feel free to drop them into the chat and I'll pull you in as appropriate. What we'd like to do is begin with some very brief introductions. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to tell us your name, institution, and orientation on the panel, like whether you're an author or an editor. And to also please include what kind of interdisciplinary collaboration you've done in the past, or reviewed in the past, just a sentence or two. And I should have introduced myself right at the start. I'm Heather Falconer from the University of Maine at Orono, and I'm serving as the facilitator for today. I'm not going to contribute my own stories. So what I'd love to do is, Suzanne, can I start with you? Could you tell us a little bit about you?
I'd be happy to. Yes, I'm Suzanne Hall, she, her. I am a teaching professor of writing at Caltech, and I direct our writing center as well. And I'm here on the panel in my capacity as the editor of Prompt. So I'll be talking a little bit about that. And I've worked with authors from across disciplines as an editor of that journal. So I'll be addressing some of those experiences.
And let's see, how about we move to Michael?
Hello, everybody. I'm Michael Pemberton, Georgia Southern University. I've written some pieces about WAC and writing centers, but I think the primary reason why I'm here today is in my editorial capacity. I was a founding editor of a journal called Language and Learning Across the Disciplines in 1994, which became Across the Disciplines in 2004 when it moved online. I am also currently the editor of ATD Books, which is a book series that is drawn largely from some of the themed issues that are published in Across the Disciplines. And I'm also the associate publisher for scholarly journals for the WAC Clearinghouse.
And you can see why we wanted his expertise. Pam, let's go to you.
Hi, welcome everybody. I'm Pam Childers. I'm the former Caldwell Chair of Composition at the Macaulay School, where I directed the WAC based writing center, and formerly executive editor of the Clearinghouse for a couple decades. And I'm currently the editor of the Excellence in K-12 WAC book series.
Okay.
So I thought maybe we could like do
Is someone talking?
I know, I'm trying to figure out where that might be coming from. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm currently the editor of the Excellence in K-12 WAC book series for the WAC Clearinghouse. It's appropriate that I'm following Michael because he and I have done a lot of work with, I've done reviews for ATD for him and also done a lot of writing on WAC and writing centers and worked collaboratively with him over the years. I think being both a collaborative author and editor, especially in cross-disciplinary scholarships on writing, is advantageous because one understands the importance and intricacies of both roles.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Chris, let's move to you.
Hey y'all, I'm Chris Baskier. I'm Director of University Writing here at Auburn University, which is our WAC WID moving towards WEC program and Writing Center and ePortfolio project. I'm also an associate editor with Michael Pemberton on Across the Disciplines books, but I'm here primarily as an author. I've published in Suzanne's Journal Prompt, and also I've published writing studies scholarship in a non-writing studies journal, so I'd be happy to talk about that. And I'm working on another opportunity along the same lines currently that's in process as well.
Wonderful. Let's see, Sarah, you're next.
Thank you, Heather. So I'm Sarah Tinker-Perot, she, her, and I am now the director of the Writing Intensive Curriculum Program at Oregon State University, where I have the honor of stepping into shoes formerly filled by Vicki Toller-Burton. And I'm here on the panel as an author. And I've only been at Oregon State for a year, but while I was at my previous institution, I was involved in a few collaborative projects. I worked with a professor in entomology to create a series of videos on how to write a research paper in entomology. I was a founding co-director of the Center for Design in the Public Interest. And as part of that team, we did both design and pedagogy work and published about both. And I was also part of a bioethics research team, which resulted in collaborative publications with team members and with some folks at other universities.
Excellent. Jay, you are next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jay Jordan. My pronouns are he, him, his. They're not showing up on the screen. So I am an associate professor in the Department of Writing and Rhetoric Studies at the University of Utah, and I have an administrative appointment working with a program called Utah Global, which is a private-public partnership supporting international student recruitment and enrollment here at the U as well. I'm here as an author. I have published WAC-related research and WAC and WIT-related research in across the disciplines, and also as part of a couple of edited collections. And I am currently in the finishing stages of revising a book in the International Exchanges series for WAC Clearinghouse on some research I did on students who start at our university's extended campus in Korea and then come to this campus in Salt Lake City, looking at some of the transnational implications of doing that kind of research, and also program administration and teaching.
Wonderful. And certainly not least, but last, I got that one all screwed up, is Maureen.
Thank you, Heather. That made me feel good. I am Maureen Matheson. I'm an associate professor also at the University of Utah. My office is down the hall from Jay. And I was a co-principal investigator on a $1.1 million William and Flora Hewlett Foundation grant to integrate speaking, writing, and ethics across the undergraduate curriculum in the College of Engineering. We were supported for 5 years through the grant, and then we're hard funded through our legislature. I was the lead and spent several years prior to the grant collaborating with the Department of Engineering, with the Department of Mechanical Engineering before we went to the whole college. So I'm here primarily as an author. After we did get the grant, we were able to assign graduate students to different departments, and I worked with them. I realized that the experience was important to write about because it really went from 1996 to 2013. And it needed to be their story. So the experience, what we thought was important for many reasons. One, it was a curriculum design that was integrated into the courses, not an add-on. Two, it was a negotiation between writing and engineering epistemologies. And three, it was from the perspective of outsiders of the base discipline, and collaboration took place between unequal partners, right? Professors of engineering, and then writing and rhetoric grad students. And so that piece culminated in an edited collection, Sojourning in Disciplinary Cultures, a case study of teaching, writing, and engineering, which was published by Utah State University in 2019.
You're muted, Heather.
I pressed that button. Sorry about that. For folks who may have joined us after I had started, our introduction. We're going to begin by asking the authors to talk a little bit about their experiences. I've asked each of the authors to share a brief story of an interdisciplinary collaborative project that they worked on, to think about some of the challenges that they encountered, some of the useful outcomes, and those kinds of things. And the first person I want to invite to share a story is Jay.
Thank you, Heather. I actually have two stories that are very, very closely related, but I'll make sure that they add up to one story in terms of length. And these will be stories that are probably pretty similar to the ones that Maureen would tell. And I was going to write in chat, but I'll just say it now. Do not let Maureen get away with being at all kind of humble or downplaying her role in the program she described, the CLEAR program in engineering here at the U, because that was, I mean, it was a master work and a model for a lot of other, I think, collaborative work. And the punchline of it, unfortunately, is not the best. What ended up happening to it, maybe that's something Maureen wants to talk about. Maureen was chair of our very young department just before I was. And so some of the effects of that bled over into my own administration. But I actually have a couple of stories related to engineering. That's really been where a lot of the collaborative work that I have done has happened. One collaboration in particular was actually with a staff member, an administrative staff member who used to be the director of that program. The program Maureen described was physically housed in the College of Engineering. And the director was actually someone who had a background in education and communication and had an office there, had a very nice suite of offices for graduate students and I think some other instructors in other categories who were working in the program, who, as Maureen described it, were fully embedded in a variety of engineering courses at an undergraduate level. And we were, this has been about a decade ago when she was actually still here. Yeah, April Kudrowitz, thank you, Dan. She went on to a position at a different institution from here. But while she was here, she kept a very close connection with us, with Maureen, with Dan, while he was a colleague of ours here. And I got involved as a brand new faculty member learning about the CLEAR program. And the long story short about that is that my collaboration with April was really about learning more about how faculty members themselves were responding to the program, their attitudes about working with primarily international students. I don't necessarily identify immediately as a WAC or WID scholar. I identify primarily as a second language writing scholar. And I think came at WAC and WID that way, because it's often the case that if you're a second language writing scholar, you work with students. If you have a pedagogical focus, you work with students, particularly if they are international students who are really interested in fields like engineering and in the sciences, you know, and in business. So I think I kind of came at it accidentally, as it were, trying to follow my students. So I got really interested in that. I knew some things about the background of other reports in literature about the ways that engineering faculty members interacted with international students. And a lot of the interactions, I mean, ran the range, you know, from very positive to somewhat negative. International students' self-reports were also quite positive and negative. I knew I wanted to learn more about those faculty attitudes. And so April and I sent a call to all of the faculty members in the college who had been teaching in the program, who actually had some of the specialist teachers embedded in their courses, and got, several responses. And one of the things I learned fairly quickly as a result of that, and April kind of, I think knew this ahead of me, and then I had to learn it from the literature, was that there could be two faculty members, for example, in a College of Engineering, who were right next door to each other. One of them, just whether it's whatever the person's attitude may be, that person may not have very much disciplinary incentive to work with students about writing, to do something like writing enhancement of existing courses. just because it doesn't make a whole lot of professional sense, for an academic engineer. Right next to that person will be a person, and I think Maureen and I and several other people have found some of these folks embedded. They may not necessarily be the most vocal faculty members, but once you find them in places like engineering or biology or nursing or public health, then they really, really become incredibly important sources of information. And you're almost worried about like over tapping them or putting them in a position in which they're like, airing out dirty laundry from their department. I started to see that happening with what I was doing in engineering because of some of the comments folks were making. But by and large, what I learned was that a lot of them were really interested in thinking through the possibility of doing what the communication program did for undergraduates at a graduate level. So that leads to the next project I was involved with. I was working while I was department chair on a multi-year committee that had been formed by our graduate school to try to enhance writing support for graduate students across the disciplines. At this point, it's kind of, in limbo. They bought an institutional subscription to Grammarly, so I guess that's something. But I was very clear with the graduate dean. I was like, you can't just stop there. It's got to be more than that. And then I kind of got onto other things. I don't know where that's sitting right now. But part of that was we were able to get some money to do some research in lab settings. And so working collaboratively with a graduate student, Teresa Chi, who is now a tenure line faculty member at Queensborough Community College in CUNY, we embedded Teresa actually as kind of like a fly on the wall in a graduate engineering lab in electrical and computer engineering. So the faculty PI, gave her a desk in the lab and she set up there and she was just like really embedded and she was learning an awful lot about what they were doing in that signal processing lab. And was sort of like an informal mentor. She was doing observational research. She was recording and transcribing and analyzing meetings that the faculty PI had with graduate students. But she was also kind of an on-the-spot consultant for writing. And so that setup, the feedback that she got from the graduate students, from the faculty PI who is now taking his lab elsewhere, and just all around, in a 360-degree fashion, was highly positive. Of course, that kind of model is incredibly expensive and not scalable, really. So we didn't come to really clear answers about what a graduate version of that program would look like. It would be beastly complicated because, particularly in a discipline like engineering, one of the things we learned is that so much is predicated on work that individual faculty PIs are doing in labs that it's almost like departmental identity matters a whole lot less at a graduate level than it might at an undergraduate level. And so there's a lot of idiosyncrasy that happens. It makes sense, but if you're trying to program, like create a writing and disciplines program at that level, it makes it challenging. So all of that to say, what I will say, this may seem like a slight change of direction, but what I will say to sum up is that the two examples of research I just talked about, one involving April Kedrowitz, who was a staff member administrator, and one involving Teresa Chi, but also involving an effort to try to increase or enhance graduate student writing support. Both of those were research projects that came out of an expressed need. In the case of April, it was, what's going on with this? And then she left shortly thereafter, for reasons that were totally unrelated. With respect to Teresa's embedding in that lab, it was research opportunity for a graduate student who needed, that experience, but also an immediate, like an exigence that was provided by a graduate school. So this is probably no surprise to a number of you, but I think one of the places to look for collaboration is to keep an ear on the ground or have an administrator or department chair or something like that who's looking out for you, to keep an ear on the ground to find out where needs are being articulated. And that's something that I think has been an experience that we have been well positioned to take advantage of, at least since I've been here.
Awesome, thank you so much. And again, if you have questions for any of our presenters as they're talking, please feel free to drop them into the chat and we can bring them in at the end. Sarah, I'd love to move to you.
Thank you, Heather. Like Jay, I'm going to tell more than one story, but my first one will be extremely brief, which is that I'm not actually going to talk about my work with the Design Center because we really didn't have challenges. I mean, we had challenges, but not in the way that is relevant to this panel. And I think that is because one of the things that Heather asked us to talk about is, do you have epistemological differences? Do you have differences on writing? Do you have differences on design? And when I was working with a design professor, we were really in sync. Our epistemological assumptions were the same. Our values were the same. I deferred to her on design. She deferred to me on writing. The process was really smooth. So I want to put that out there as a positive example, but not a learning moment example. On the learning front, what I'd like to talk about briefly is the bioethics team that I was part of. This was led by the Dean's Professor of Bioethics at the medical school of the university I then worked at. It was partly grant funded, but mostly we mostly wrote and did not get grants, although we did get some. And this is the one where we published in some bioethics journals, and also one of my colleagues there and I published in Perspectives in Biology and Medicine. So we ran into two challenges that I think are worth thinking and talking about. And one is, what happens when a team puts a lot of work into a project that is being led by one person on the team who has specific expertise, where the project is being aimed at a specific journal relevant to that person's expertise, and then that person becomes very busy with something else and drops the project. So, you know, there were no hard feelings on our team, but we had a few projects that got 75% of the way there, and then the lead got a fellowship to do something absolutely amazing else, and the project just fizzled. And there we were, having put in time. And, you know, we had philosophers, rhetoricians, linguists, retcomp people, and a lawyer, you know, and if one of those people fizzles out on the project, the others can't fill in for their expertise. The bigger challenge we ran into was not within our team, which worked together really well, but it was actually with the scientists we worked with. So at the time, we were doing a fair bit of work with a genetics lab that was moving from doing basic research toward doing more applied work or research that could be applied in human genome modification. And we're very interested in promoting that work. And what we ran into is something that Balmer et al. Have identified, and I'll put the link or the citation rather in the chat, because it's a very interesting piece, which is about the kinds of roles that social science and humanities scholars tend to end up with when working with scientists. And I'm going to mention the three roles that we hoped we would come in with, and then the three roles that we actually ended up with. So we hope to come in, one role Balmer et al. Identify as the colleague, where you're viewed as co-equal colleagues. Related to that, another role is co-producer of knowledge, where ideally we would be working with people in the sciences who are saying, hey, lawyers and rhetoricians and writing specialists and bioethicists have knowledge that is relevant here too. And even potentially to play the role that they'd identify as the critic. Which is a very positive role that we, coming from humanities and social sciences, can play, like by uncovering hidden assumptions, uncovering hidden biases. But as Balmer et al. Point out, this can lead to problems when our collaborators don't see their assumptions or biases, or don't think that they're problems. And they say, well, yeah, sure, I'm a biased human, but my science is objective because science. So the roles we ended up actually being cast in were the representative of the public, which is the people who are supposed to help them sell their work to outsiders. Oh, you do rhetoric. You can help us with our public relations problem because people think modifying babies' genomes is unethical. We ended up partly cast in the role of the foreteller, who, as Balmer et al. Described, is supposed to see how a technology is going to be received and smooth the commercialization process. So, for example, working with this lab, they also had somebody who was in, the bench to bedside thing. And they were very interested in, how can we patent this? How can we get it out to people? And we were raising really awkward questions like, well, should it be gotten out to people? Is it really needed? And then the third role that Balmer et al. Mentioned that I think a lot of folks here will relate to is, quote, the wife. And that includes the expectation that, well, you're communications people, so you're going to do all the emotional labor. You're going to manage all the communication on the project. Oh, if people disagree, we'll just give it to you. And also Balmer et al. Mentioned the sort of subcategory of the trophy wife, which is, as I used to say, we're not here to put ethics lipstick on your research pig, right? So as humanities and social science people can add value to a project, sometimes it's seen as, well, we got our writer on board, so now we can just go ahead and mention, oh, we have a writer, or oh, we have an ethicist, and so on. So I think the key point that I take away from these contrasting examples is that oftentimes we go into a collaboration where we may be thinking in terms of, do we have complementary expertise? Do we have complementary bodies of knowledge? But I think it's very important to also upfront talk about, do we have shared value sets? Or if we don't have a shared value set, do we have an overlap in our value set? And that is where we will focus our project. And then to the extent that we don't have a shared value set or don't have overlap in our value set, to work with teams where people are really honest about institutional power and issues of institutional power. Because institutionally speaking, the scientists had way more than we did. And this was reflected in a lot of things. One is they're having a lot of money, which we did not have. Another is in there sending a postdoc to our team meetings where we as faculty were expected to show up. And I could keep going, but just to really surface those issues, as I think Maureen has done a lot with too, and Jay has touched on. I mean, Jay has also done a lot. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you in Maureen's shadow there, Jay. Although it's an honorable place to be if you are. But just to make sure to really bring to the surface those issues of disciplinary power and we're all in Maureen's shadow, and it's a great place to be. Yeah. To bring to the surface those issues of disciplinary power, disciplinary values, and make them an open part of the conversation as you're getting started in a project, and helping that shape whether and how you are involved in the project.
I have many stories I could share along those lines as well. I love that you brought that up. But it's not my turn. It's Chris's turn to talk.
Thanks. I think I'm going to echo a lot of what Jay and Sarah have said about finding kind of those opportune moments and those kind of inroads to working with colleagues across the disciplines on publication processes. My two main projects on that front have been with biology and with poultry science. If you've never heard of that before, we have a dedicated department of poultry science, and they go from farm to table, basically. So my partnership with biology really began when I took a team of biology faculty to University of Minnesota for their STEM Right Institute. Hey, Dan. Hey, Matt. Where we were learning about integrating writing to learn and peer review into large enrollment courses. And they were interested in this because they had just started redoing their student learning outcomes and kind of had a new cadre of faculty who were more interested in active learning and that sort of thing. And that really has spawned an ongoing partnership with that department over the last 4 years. My colleague, Amy Shikino, just got done partnering them on integrating course-based undergraduate research experiences into their curriculum as well. But what I'll talk about is my partnership with Bob Boyd, who is a plant biologist. He has now moved up to being Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. And he was really the spearhead in the department on the curriculum redesign. He was the undergraduate program director at the time. And so they totally revamped their SLOs. He had gone to some biology-focused education conferences and came back really jazzed about metacognition. And so he really was invested in trying to do some work in his courses that he felt could then be models for his colleagues who maybe were a little bit reluctant or unsure about what all these new SLOs would look like in their courses. And he taught a kind of a bridge senior/graduate level conservation biology course. And he thought that that would be ripe for redoing. He really wanted to integrate, redo the writing assignment and also integrate some reflective writing in support of the new metacognition SLO. I'll also say that the revised writing SLO that I had helped polish with the department included recognition of the need to be able to communicate to scientific and non-scientific audiences. And he had already in that class had students making like website entries about rare species in Alabama. And they would do 2 websites, and he's like, the first one was always okay. The second ones were really not very good. The students didn't seem interested or didn't seem to really care that much. And he was interested in thinking about what would be a different approach. And at that time, he had an extra credit assignment where the students could write an encyclopedia entry for the Encyclopedia of Alabama. And I said, why not make that a mandatory assignment for everybody? It hits your mark of public writing, and you could have them reflect on the process of taking the website entry that they first create that's meant for specialists in conservation biology and repurposing it for a public audience. And he said, that's great, let's do that. So we brought on Claire Wilson from the Encyclopedia of Alabama to do some editorial work, and we revamped the assignments and created a whole bunch of reflective prompts. And he was really enthusiastic about the results. And I said, there's this journal called Prompt. And I think it would be a good venue for sharing the work that you've done in redesigning these assignments and sharing some of the student reflections and so on and so forth. And I think he was already eyeing the associate dean position and thought, well, maybe a teaching focused publication could kind of bolster his background in addition to all the curricular work that he had already done. So he said, yeah, let's do it. And I think, we had a really nice collaborative relationship. So I think as far as co-authoring, we actually didn't hit a ton of roadblocks. I think it was more so when we got to the peer review stage with Prompt, having to do the work of making sure that what he and I and Claire understood about the context and the curriculum and the field was translated in a way for people who aren't familiar with that. And especially in such a way that readers could think pretty clearly about how they would adapt this kind of repurposing assignment for their own disciplinary context, rather than thinking, well, this is something that would only work in conservation biology. So his kind of readiness and willingness was really the exigence, I think, that allowed me to do that co-authoring with him. The other project that's currently in progress is with Poultry Science, and I've worked with them for a couple of years to integrate a multi-course simulation of a poultry co-op with all the writing assignments tied into the co-op. So it's things like food safety reports and product marketing and so on and so forth. And I've had the associate dean in the College of Agriculture as a real champion of high impact practices. So she's really been one to help spur that partnership. But I think another thing that's really helped is that college actually has the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning explicitly recognized in its tenure and promotion guidelines. So if you ever see anything that's even sort of gently suggesting SOTL as something that's valued, that's probably a department or a program or a college you want to go talk to, because there could be a really great partnership with that program. People could get really excited about that. We're aiming to publish that work in a poultry science journal. And one of the things that I learned that's a potential obstacle is their fields are some of the fields that actually make the authors pay to publish. It's very common there and continues to blow my mind, but here we are, right? So that's just something that you might expect if you're starting to do some of these interdisciplinary collaborations. And we're lucky that we had a pool of money for this project that we had funded already, and we had saved some money when a couple faculty members dropped out. And so we were able to just transfer that money over to the publication fees. So that'll be good. The last thing I'll talk about real quick is the piece that I published with my graduate student, Amber Simpson, in Studies in Higher Education. So she's a Rec Comp grad student, so I wouldn't consider she and I an interdisciplinary team, but Studies in Higher Education is an international journal outside, sort of, I guess, of writing studies adjacent. She and I had been doing research on faculty members' threshold concepts for teaching writing in the disciplines. And as we were working on it, we realized that the methodology was detailed enough and I think unique enough that it could have its own separate publication from the findings. And we thought it also would have legs beyond WAC or writing studies. And so we targeted studies in higher ed as a venue for the methodology section. And I think the real challenge there was having to explain in the article succinctly but clearly what WAC is, what WAC faculty development is, how it looks in the context of United States education, because this is an international publication where not everybody is going to have the same kinds of WAC contexts that we have here. And so we had to really just be super clear about what that context is as we were sort of setting the stage for what really was ultimately not necessarily a WAC specific methodology, something that we thought had legs. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so our last author speaker is Maureen Matheson.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think these are all really good stories talking about people's experience. I want to talk about kind of the design of the program that we had with engineering, because it was very unique. And as Jay said, we were all embedded within engineering. Our offices were over there. The pay came through engineering. And for the most part, they were writing and rhetoric, communication and philosophy students, but in many ways they had two homes, right? And so this idea of sojourning comes from Michael Bickram's idea in second language acquisition, where he talks about the difference between a sojourner and a tourist. And a tourist goes someplace and they just take in all the sights and they leave and they don't really make a difference where they've been, right? A sojourner goes with the idea of staying longer, getting to know the people, getting to know the culture. And so the idea was that we were sojourning, right, in a disciplinary culture. Engineering was so distinct, as you know, epistemologically, right? They think visually. They think lastly with words. That took a while to understand. They're very driven by algorithms, and I think in some ways what we found was a host of, we were talking about assumptions, anything from shared assumptions, like assuming shared assumptions about writing, what constitutes good writing, to well, you're in the humanities, so you just do that fluffy stuff, right? That's what someone said once. You just do that fluffy stuff, right? It's like, not really. And so I think that one of the things that we did when we went in was to not just work with one professor, but initially what we did starting out was work in one department, which was mechanical engineering. And I spent the first year doing ethnographies in the major classrooms. And so in those, then what I would find is instances where it would make sense for writing to take place, right? And then I would work with the professors, right, to actually co-design assignments. And so in that sense, some of the things that came out as we used this model to work with other departments. So we were in bioengineering, we were in chemical engineering, we were in civil engineering. We were in 6 departments, and we had one graduate student per department for writing that would work with multiple professors to do this work, to go in and see where the courses, which courses were best suited for writing and how to get them to the end point. So we used a backward design, thinking where do they need to end up in engineering and as writers? And then we worked backwards, saying, well, what courses? Usually those were core courses. And so we worked with them to design assignments. We also used Vygotsky's this idea of spiraling, right? Kind of that, you know, we went from the less difficult to the more difficult, and then it would go back to reinforce and then move forward, right? So the curriculum itself was designed by both. And I think for some of those assumptions, for example, in one course, I think it was chemical engineering. They said, well, you know, our students are pretty good writers, so we don't need a lot, but they really have problems with critical thinking. And so, of course, you know, we're thinking about critical thinking as argumentation, because that has often been the way we think about it in writing. And they were thinking about critical thinking as, well, you know, they get to the end of a project and they really don't understand the implications. So we really need to work on that. And so our person, our point person, actually it was Sarah Reed, who now is at Portland State doing work in technical and professional, I think. She actually went in and read a lot of the literature on critical thinking in engineering and created a library for that department and started working on assignments to help them enhance critical thinking along the way. So each department had separate needs. And so I want to say that we did work with individual professors, but we also worked at the department level. And so that was great. And the grant allowed us to actually establish a really nice foundation where at a certain point, the courses were already identified, and then writing instructors would go in and work with professors and students and fine tune assignments, change them if they needed, right, in collaboration with the professor. I think two of the things that I think that, you know, are really high points for me is one of the professors said that he had actually worked in industry before he went to become a professor. And he said, this is just such a wonderful opportunity for these students. They actually were writing feasibility reports for the city of Salt Lake for road construction. And if you actually go down one of our beltways and get off at exit 13, University of Utah civil engineers designed that exit, right? So they came away with this sense of the relationship between writing and doing, putting something into effect. And so that was beautiful. And then the other situation that I think really shows what can happen when people are embedded was that we had a graduate student working in bioengineering. And ultimately they said, you know, we don't need any more writing and rhetoric TAs because we're going to hire her full time. She has become a bioengineer for our purposes, in the sense that when she works with our students, she knows what they're talking about. She knows how to work with them on their writing to connect it to the bioengineering. And so, I mean, those are really good examples, I think, of what can be done when someone is embedded within a department full-time, gets to know the professors, gets to know the students. As Jay said, there's an unhappy ending to this. In 2013, the Dean of Engineering decided that it wasn't what he wanted to do anymore, and pulled the funding from us, and so kept that funding, which we helped get. And so they now have standalone courses where they just, you know, have courses where they learn, you know, whatever. So for, you know, from 1996 to 2013, it was really a beautiful program, I think. And, you know, in writing the book, I went back. The last chapter of the book is to go back to some of the professors who actually we worked with. And they were saying, you know, that the negative things that came out were, and not negative, I don't think they're negative. I think they're things to put on the table, as we were talking about when we work across disciplines, that there were unspoken expectations, right? Initially, you first come to a class, what do I need you to do, right? The second thing was that because there was turnover, that sometimes our students didn't reach the level of expertise that they wanted, right? So in that sense, but the takeaway, and this is my last comment, is that many of them said that they actually channel the voices of our instructors as they now teach their own courses. Yeah, so that's I want to end there because I want to make sure that people can have the time to talk.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I know I'm trying to be a good timekeeper. I don't think I'm doing a very good job. We have 3 editors. We have Pam, Suzanne, and Michael. And because we have about 15 minutes left, I would love actually kind of mix it up. And could I ask each of you to offer us maybe 1 or 2 benefits and 1 or 2 challenges that you see as an editor about interdisciplinary composing, something that our audience might find useful in their own work. And you can choose who to speak first.
Well, I'll be glad to jump in there and get out so everybody else can speak. I've had the privilege of, for the last 20 years, of being the executive editor of the Clearinghouse, which was published for 100 years. It started in 1920. So I wasn't there then, but some of my friends will say I was. But because it's an educational journal and published by Taylor and Francis, we have a diverse group of manuscripts coming in from middle and secondary people, but mostly education professors. And our consulting editors are all specialized professors in different disciplines. And so that's great. And so that makes it very easy for me as an executive editor to assign 2 consulting editors to do blind reviews of each manuscript that's submitted. And then I do the final review and send it back. And for me, as a WAC Writing Center person, I am delighted when I see a manuscript that deals with any kind of interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary subjects. The joy that I get most is for those of you who are old enough to remember Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney movies, is playing the, oh, I'll do the sets, saying, oh, how about doing a series special issue on art education? How about doing, so I could ask people who had maybe submitted a manuscript, or one of our consulting editors who was a math professor in California, or a science professor in Tennessee. I could say, why don't you suggest a special issue and I'll help you with the whole process. So I, as executive editor, could help them create the call for proposals, the whole process right on through to publication. And my last one, when I retired from that position at the end of 2020, and we just published the last series issue in June that I mentored. And so that's thrilling. And to work with people in different disciplines in creating and selecting the articles and the whole process is exciting. And that's the fun part. And that's something that I've always enjoyed, especially when it deals with scholarship and pedagogical practices on writing. And the other thing that I've enjoyed is collaborating with a science colleague on several edited collections, one of which we did for ATD for Michael. And so that was kind of fun too. So taking the role of editor of those that are submitting articles for your own edited collection or for your journal are both very rewarding and time consuming. And I'd say the part of the challenge for all that is with the journal in particular, We have people that have just completed a doctorate. They want to submit their dissertation. You know, it's been praised and everything else. And the two reviewers go, what? This is not for our audience. This is not. And so I tell our reviewers, I said, you're blind to them as they're blind to you. So you can be honest in your response to them. And some of them come back to the managing editor who sends these on to me, since Taylor and Francis handles that part of it. And they'll, say how insulted they are. And, this was praised as a great piece of writing and so forth. And so I have the difficult position of explaining to them who the audience is for this and whether they're defining the terms that need to be explained to that audience. And that is a challenge, but it's a joy when they continue to revise and complete that manuscript for publication. So if they're willing to do the revisions, maybe several revisions, that's fine. The other one is, and some of you talked about dealing with international students, when we receive a submission, a manuscript that is not in, quote, American English, our reviewers sometimes have a great deal of difficulty dealing with that. And so it ends up on my shoulder as the executive editor to explain to them with examples of how they could make that more appropriate for an audience that's primarily reading in American English. And so that's a challenge, but it's, again, rewarding when we see them go through the revisions and finally succeed. The frustrating ones, that are few and far between, but I've talked with several other editors about this, are the ones that are submitted that are really more of a rough draft than a final manuscript to submit for publication. And I take that as an insult to my reviewers, because they have to put a lot of time into looking at something like that. And again, I remind them that they are anonymous to the author, so that they can very easily say, exactly what. Please look at a copy of this journal. Please look at the format and the guidelines for submission before you resubmit. And so, that makes my job easier, but that's something that is one of the challenges that I think we all have to deal with as editors, because it's very clear that as editors, we put in those guidelines for submissions for a reason. And so that's probably the most frustrating part of the job, but mostly it's a joy to work with writers through the process.
I'm going to drop a comment in the chat, and Michael, you go ahead and talk.
Oh, I was just about to cede my time to you. Since we have a very short amount of time left, I'll try to make my comments pretty brief. I think that a lot of the things that I would say about the benefits of working for as an editor for an interdisciplinary journal have been expressed quite well, not only by by Pam, but also by each and every one of the authors who have talked about the collaborations that they've had with their colleagues. One of the best things for me as an editor is being able to have the opportunity to read about some of this really interesting and exciting work. And the best work is the work that actually opens doors in our field that haven't really been opened before. I think that as editors and as professionals in a discipline, we tend to oftentimes, even in an interdisciplinary field like WAC, we tend to be very siloed in our perspectives. And to be honest with you, this is one of my major concerns as an editor. I've done some work thinking about what it means to be a disciplinary gatekeeper, and especially in the context of what is billed as an interdisciplinary journal like Across the Disciplines, because it's a journal that proclaims itself to be open to a variety of different kinds of methodologies, epistemologies, kinds of scholarship and writing. But at the end of the day, this is a journal whose primary audience is people in writing studies, writing across the curriculum, and the like. So when people in other disciplines, disciplines outside of writing studies, submit manuscripts, oftentimes when I decide that they're worth sending out to reviewers, reviewers correspond back and say, well, this person is trying to present something as novel that we've known about in the field for 40 years. So they need to read this book, they need to read these articles, they need to refer to this line of scholarship. And as an editor, this puts me in a really conflicted space, because I think that it's wrong to overvalue the disciplinary conventions of my own field when I'm trying to publish work that represents the best scholarship and thinking and methodology of people in other fields and other areas as well. So this is sort of one of the biggest challenges, and I think it's probably true for all editors, but maybe even more so for those who are editing journals that are trying to be interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, which is, how do you make decisions about who gets in and who gets out, who gets published and who doesn't, and who gets to set the criteria for what is acceptable scholarship and publishable scholarship for the audience that you're trying to address in your journal. So if I were to provide any kind of advice at all to those of you who are doing this kind of scholarship, part of that advice would be to think seriously about how to accurately and adequately represent the paradigms and epistemologies of the people who are not writing studies colleagues, and to do so in ways that are not colonial, that do not attempt to impose or superimpose your perspectives on their areas and their disciplines and the way that they look at their research and think about writing. So that's in a 2.5-minute nutshell what I would say. Suzanne, do you want to kind of jump in here and add to that?
No, I think you brought up something I think a lot about too, so I appreciate that. And I just put in the chat, I really want folks here to know about our journal and what we do, and that I agree with Daniel's comment earlier that as a field, we need to figure out how to sponsor and support people to do the big empirical projects. But part of why Prompt exists is because not everyone can do that or can do it all the time. And so we're a journal that hopefully people are excited to write to when that's not in the cards for funding reasons, for time reasons, and all of that. So it's still a substantive intellectual journal. It's peer reviewed, but it's not a research article. And I'd be happy to talk to anyone individually after this session who'd be interested in querying me about anything related to the journal. Thanks.
Thank you all. I am so sorry that we ran out of time. I'm kind of beat myself up for that for days. But for folks who are here as audience members, if you do have questions, you can email me. I'm happy to field them on to our panelists, and we can always collectively get some feedback back to people. I want to thank everybody who attended, and thank you so much to our panelists for giving your time and expertise to all of us. It was really wonderful to listen to your stories.